Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the CMRITO Standards of Practice, Standard 1, Legislation, Standards, and Ethics. My name is Carrie, and I'm the Quality Assurance and Professional Practice Director at CMRITO. I'm also a registrant to the College in the Specialty of Nuclear Medicine, and it is my pleasure to be here today to provide some education on legislation, standards, and ethics to support you in your practice.
My name is Choi, Quality Assurance and Professional Practice Manager. I am also a registrant under the specialty of diagnostic medical sonography. As Carrie mentioned, in this video, we will be reviewing Standards of Practice 1, Legislation, Standards, and Ethics. Let's begin with a land acknowledgement. The work of CMRITO, our registrants and system partners, takes place on traditional Indigenous territories across the land currently called Ontario. We are thankful to the First Nations peoples, Inuit, and Métis from across Turtle Island who have stewarded these territories since time immemorial and continue to contribute to the strength of communities across the land today. We are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and play on this land. Ontario is home to vast traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Haudenosaunee, Delaware, and Algonquin peoples. Includes 46 historical treaties, 207 reserves held by 127 of the 128 First Nations of the province, and a portion of the Métis Nation homeland. The name Ontario is derived from the Haudenosaunee word Canadario, which translates to sparkling water. We invite you to begin or deepen your own reconciliation journey by learning more about the Indigenous people of your area. Let's review our goals for today's session. First, we're going to take a closer look at Standard 1, which focuses on legislation, standards, and ethics. Next, we'll work on understanding your responsibilities as a medical radiation and imaging technologist, or MRIT. We'll also review the purpose and key components of the CMRITO Code of Ethics. We'll also identify other important resources that support Standard 1 and the resources CMRITO provides to support your practice. And so by the end of the session, you should feel more confident in applying legislation, standards, and ethics in professional decision-making. I'll now pass it on to Carrie.
Thanks, Johnny. Let's take a brief moment to do a high-level overview of the standards of practice set by CMRITO. These standards form the foundation of professional practice for all MRT and DMS professionals in Ontario. So the standards exist to clearly outline the expectations for safe, competent, and ethical practice. They help ensure that every registrant, regardless of specialty or years of experience, provides care that protects the public, supports patient safety, and maintains professional accountability. They also give the public a transparent understanding of what they can expect from medical radiation and imaging technologists when under their care. So the standards of practice provide a framework for the college's practice expectations. The publication also includes the MRIT scope of practice and the controlled acts authorized to MRITs, which we will review here in a few moments in the presentation today. There are 8 standards in the standards of practice. Today, we're going to be focusing and discussing on Standard 1, legislation, standards, and ethics. So CMRITO as an organization, we're committed to developing resources to support understanding and compliance with the standards. In addition to the presentation you're going to be watching today, you'll also find a number of different publications and webinars related to the standards of practice on our website, which we'll highlight in the session today. So there are overarching expectations in the standards of practice that form the foundation of safe, ethical, and professional care. First and foremost, or maybe not even foremost, just first, registrants must be competent. Competent means having the knowledge and the technical skills and the judgment needed to practice safely, effectively, and ethically. It also means applying that knowledge and skill consistently to ensure the best possible outcomes for patients. Maintaining competence is an ongoing responsibility, so registrants must stay current in their area of practice, and if they find themselves in a situation where they're not competent to perform a task or procedure, they must not proceed. Instead, they're expected to take appropriate action to address the situation and any potential gaps in their competence before delivering care. Second, registrants must be accountable. Accountability means taking responsibility for one's decisions and actions, whether those actions are taken independently or as part of a team. So registrants are expected to act based on their clinical judgment and always in the best interest of the patient. So for example, if you believe that a procedure or treatment plan is unsafe, contraindicated, or not in the patient's best interest, you must not carry it out. Instead, you must take appropriate steps to address the concern. Accountability includes recognizing when patient interests are being compromised and responding appropriately to safeguard those interests. Finally, registrants are expected to be collaborative. Collaboration is essential in modern healthcare. It means working effectively with other members of the healthcare team to support the best possible outcomes for patients. This includes communicating clearly, coordinating care, and sharing relevant information. When there are gaps in care or differences in clinical judgment, registrants are responsible for taking appropriate action to resolve those issues and ensure continuity and safety in patient care. In summary, competence, accountability, and collaboration are core expectations that underpin all of the standards of practice. And now Johnny will take you through a closer look at the format and structure of the standards of practice with a specific focus on standard 1. So now over to you, Johnny.
Thanks, Carrie. The standards of practice is laid out into 8 different sections: legislation, standards and ethics, equipment and materials, diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, safe practice, relationships with patients, professional relationships, records and reporting, and continuing competence. In this webinar, we will be focusing on Standard 1, legislation, standards, and ethics. In the standards of practice document, each standard is arranged in the same format. We start with a brief introduction to describe the background and overview of the standard. Next, the practice standard statement is presented. This is then followed by indicators, which provide more specific actions and requirements that registrants must partake in and adhere to in order to meet the standard. Let's dive deeper into Standard 1. We begin with the introduction that describes the high-level registration requirements of registrants, that they must meet the professional education and registration requirements set out by the college. Registrants must also continue to educate themselves about practical, legal, ethical, and other matters pertaining to the profession. Also, registrants must be competent, accountable, and collaborative in their practice. Next, we have the practice standard statement, which states that registrants must understand and adhere to the legislation governing the practice of the profession, the standards of practice set by the college, the code of ethics, and the bylaws of the college. We will be reviewing all of these components in this webinar. Below the standard, we have the indicators, and they indicate the application of the practice standard in a specific dimension of practice. Most indicators refer to tasks that are common to all registrants, just like this one. In other sections of the standards of practice, there are indicators that refer to tasks generally performed by registrants practicing in one of the specialties, which are listed under separate headings. In general, the methods for implementing each task may be determined by departmental policies and procedures. As listed, registrants must have the knowledge, skills, and judgment to perform procedures undertaken in the course of the practice of the profession, take responsibility for decisions and actions, including those undertaken independently and those undertaken as a member of the team, work with other members of the healthcare team to achieve the best possible outcomes for the patient, adhere to all relevant provincial and federal legislation and guidelines governing the practice of the profession, and adhere to the standards of practice, code of ethics, and the bylaws of the college. And as well, registrants of CMRITO must adhere to all regulations made under the Medical Radiation and Imaging Technology Act, including the provisions for quality assurance, registration, professional misconduct, and advertising. For a deeper dive into the legislation, I'll pass it back to Carrie.
So now that we have an understanding of the purpose and structure of the standards of practice, let's start to dive deeper into Standard 1, starting with an overview of the legislative framework that governs MRIT practice. So you'll see the Regulated Health Professions Act, or RHPA. So that's the first arch you see there at the top, is the main legislation that governs 29 health professions in Ontario. It also sets out 14 controlled acts that are deemed too dangerous to be performed by the general public. These 14 controlled acts may only be performed by regulated health professionals who are authorized under legislation to do so. So each profession has their own profession-specific act, which defines their scope of practice and in some cases gives the authority to perform some of the controlled acts. So for example, the Medical Radiation and Imaging Technology Act, or MRIT Act, defines the scope of practice for MRITs and also authorizes MRITs to perform 5 of the 14 controlled acts, which Johnny's going to review with you momentarily. There's also regulations that govern our profession. So some of these are under the RHPA and the MRIT Act, but others are separate laws altogether. These regulations set the college's registration processes, professional conduct expectations, and quality assurance program requirements as examples. Many regulations are common to all regulated health professions with small differences from college to college. And finally, bylaws are the rules that govern exactly how a regulatory college like CMRITO operates. So legislation authorizes a council to make bylaws related to the college's governance, administration, and regulatory functions. So we skipped ahead a little bit early with the slide, but let's take a little more closely look at the legislation that governs MRIT practice. There are key statutes that determine how the medical radiation and imaging technology profession is regulated in Ontario. These are the Regulated Health Professions Act, or RHPA, which was introduced on the previous slide, the Medical Radiation and Imaging Technology Act, or MRIT Act. Also relevant to our practice is the Healing Arts Radiation Protection Act, or the HARP Act, and the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, or the NSCA. And we're going to touch on each of these in a bit more detail. So yes, let's start with the RHPA. This is the overarching provincial legislation governing all regulated health professions in Ontario. It defines which health professions are regulated and how they are regulated. It sets out the composition of health profession colleges and provisions for college functions, including registration, quality assurance, and complaints and discipline processes. It provides a framework for public protection and accountabilities. For example, it requires each health profession to develop standards of practice, entry to practice requirements, and mechanisms to monitoring ongoing competence. It also sets out the controlled acts that could pose a risk of harm or danger if done by unqualified or unauthorized individuals. And as mentioned previously, each health profession regulated under the RHPA has their own profession-specific act. In the case of our profession, it's the MRIT Act. Like the RHPA, the MRIT Act has a number of regulations under the Act which further sets out the practice of registrants. As a reminder, the MRIT Act defines the scope of practice for the profession and also grants authority to MRITs to perform 5 of the 14 controlled acts from the RHPA, and we will cover these in a bit more detail. The MRIT Act also sets out restricted titles for the profession, which is an important part of public protection, as it assures patients that the technologists who are providing medical radiation and imaging technology services to them are 1, registered with the college, and 2, qualified to practice the profession. There are specific sets of regulations under the MRIT Act which further govern MRIT practice. The Quality Assurance Regulation, which falls under the General Regulation, or OREG 375/12, defines CMRITO's QA program, including components and administration of the program. The Advertising Regulation also falls under the General Regulation and places limits on the advertisement of a registrant's practice. The Registration Regulation, which is OREG 31/24, describes the classes of certificates of registration, as well as the requirements and conditions for registration. And the Professional Misconduct Regulation, which is OREG 855/93 or 93, lists acts which are considered professional misconduct for the purpose of the college's complaints, investigations, and discipline processes. And I will pass it back to Johnny now, who will review the scope of practice and controlled acts in a bit more detail.
Thanks, Carrie. In terms of scope of practice stated in the MRIT Act, the practice of medical radiation and imaging technology is the use of ionizing radiation, electromagnetism, sound waves, and other prescribed forms of energy for the purpose of diagnostic or therapeutic procedures, the evaluation of images and data relating to the procedures, and the assessment of an individual before, during, and after the procedures. This is an overview statement of the areas of practice that registrants fall under in their profession. Now, not every registrant will perform the entirety of the scope of practice, which leads us to the next part, the controlled acts. Under the RHPA, there are 14 controlled acts or specific procedures or activities that can be performed by authorized regulated health professionals. Controlled acts may only be performed by health professionals in their practice if the controlled act is authorized to them under their profession-specific legislation, such as the 5 acts that are authorized to MRITs. A controlled act may also be performed if it is delegated to them by a health professional who is authorized to perform it, or if an exemption or exception exists. So MRITs are authorized to perform 5 of the 14 controlled acts under the RHPA, which include administer substance by injection or inhalation, for example, administering contrast media or pharmaceuticals required for specific procedures intravenously. An example of administering a substance by inhalation would be oxygen, or in nuclear medicine, there is a procedure that looks at airflow to the lungs and requires administration of a radioactive aerosol that the patient inhales. Tracheal suctioning is not very commonly performed, but sometimes needed in radiation therapy. Some examples of the third authorized act would be transvaginal ultrasound exams, administering barium enema for a lower GI series in an X-ray, urinary catheterization for avoiding cystogram studies that evaluate the bladder filling and emptying. Performing a procedure on a tissue below the dermis. Most common is venipuncture, putting in IVs, tattooing in radiation therapy. And of course, the last one is fairly self-explanatory, applying sound waves for ultrasound and electromagnetism for MRI exams. When performing procedures within their specialty, registrants of CMRITO are authorized to perform 5 of the 14 controlled acts from the RHPA, as long as it is in the course of engaging in the practice of medical radiation and imaging technology. For example, performing a procedure on tissue below the dermis. Registrants may set up an IV as part of a medical imaging protocol, but are not permitted to perform medical aesthetics injections, such as injecting substances like Botox, because it is not part of the practice of medical radiation and imaging technology. They must have the knowledge, skill, and judgment to perform the act and manage any outcomes. They must ensure that an appropriate order is in place authorizing performance of the procedure. Sometimes this is called a requisition. Finally, registrants must only act subject to any terms, conditions, and limitations imposed on their certification of registration. Here is a list of common examples of controlled acts in practice, ranging from inserting an IV line for contrast administration, to administering oxygen, and to tattooing in radiation therapy. We try to include examples from all 5 specialties of the CMRITO. And speaking about specialties, while the MRIT profession has a single scope of practice, there are 5 different specialties regulated under CMRITO, and those are radiography, radiation therapy, nuclear medicine, magnetic resonance, and diagnostic medical sonography. Each of these specialties have their own specific registration requirements under the registration regulation in the MRIT Act, and each of the specialties may include performance of some or all of the controlled acts previously discussed within the context of their specialty. So each of these specialties have restricted titles and abbreviations that only individuals registered with CMRITO in those specialties are authorized to use. Once an individual has fulfilled all their registration requirements, only then are they authorized to use these titles and abbreviations. So for example, I am authorized to use the abbreviation DMS. If you resign your registration with CMRITO, you are no longer authorized to use the titles or abbreviations. It is illegal for an individual who is not registered with CMRITO to use the restricted titles. And it is also important to note that you cannot alter the titles or abbreviations. Now that we've completed the highlights of the RHPA and MRIT Act, I will now pass it on to Carrie to describe other legislation relevant to MRITs.
Thanks, Johnny. So now that we've refamiliarized ourselves with the RHPA and the MRIT Act, let's briefly look at the other important pieces of legislation that govern MRIT practice: the Healing Arts Radiation Protection Act, or the HARP Act, and the Nuclear Safety and Control Act, or the NSCA. It's important to note that ionizing radiation and nuclear materials are not regulated under the RHPA or the MRIT Act. Instead, we look to the HARP Act and the NSCA. So first up, the HARP Act, MRIT's authorization, sorry, I'm just going to put the slide back there. MRIT's authorization to apply X-rays to humans comes from the HARP Act. This is the provincial legislation which regulates the use of X-ray machines for the irradiation of a human being. It sets out who is authorized or qualified to apply X-rays on humans. This list includes MRITs, physicians, dental surgeons, chiropodists with some conditions, chiropractors, and dental hygienists. The HARP Act would be applicable to registrants of CMRITO who perform procedures involving the application of X-ray radiation, including radiographers, radiation therapists, and nuclear medicine technologists. Of important note, in accordance with the HARP Act and the CMRITO Standards of Practice, any procedure involving the application of X-ray radiation on a human being requires an order. The HARP Act also sets out who can order X-ray procedures. CMRITO has published a handy table in our publication, What You Must Know About Performing Procedures, that summarizes who is authorized to order and apply X-ray radiation. This publication is linked at the end of this presentation, but examples include physicians, chiropractors, and nurse practitioners. Similar to the other statutes, the aim of the HARP Act is to protect the public by minimizing radiation exposure and ensuring only those who are qualified can operate X-ray equipment for the purpose of irradiating humans. And last but not least, the possession and use of nuclear substances or radiopharmaceuticals is regulated under the Federal Nuclear Safety and Control Act. This is applicable to the practice of nuclear medicine and radiation therapy. So this regulation covers site licensing, obligations of licensees, radiation safety, record keeping, and reporting. Registrants working in nuclear medicine or radiation therapy need to be aware of their CNSC license conditions and act accordingly. As we wrap up this section, I'm just sharing a table from the CMRITO Jurisprudence course, Module 1 on legislation, which provides a high-level overview of how different types of energy are regulated. The types of energy regulated under the RHPA are electromagnetism for MR and sound waves for ultrasound, and this is done via the controlled acts model, whereas the HARP Act regulates ionizing radiation, X-ray radiation specifically, by regulating the use and operation of X-ray equipment. An order from an authorized health professional is required regardless of the energy type. The last section of this chart is regarding delegation. Under the RHPA, delegation is the process by which a regulated health professional authorized to perform one of the controlled acts confers authority to someone, regulated or unregulated, who is not authorized to perform that controlled act, the ability to do it. So an example for this that might be relevant to our practice is communicating to an individual or their personal representative a diagnosis. This is a controlled act that's not authorized to registrants as CMRITO. However, registrants who perform procedures where pregnancy may be contraindicated may need to communicate pregnancy test results to their patient after performing a pregnancy test. If communicating these results is considered communicating a diagnosis, then this could only occur or be performed by an MRIT if the physician delegated the authority to the MRIT. In the HARP Act, there are no provisions for delegation. So this means that only those individuals listed in the HARP Act are authorized to order or apply X-ray radiation on a human, and this act cannot be delegated to any other individual. Also, it's important for registrants to understand that under the CMRITO Standards of Practice, CMRITO registrants cannot delegate their authorized acts to other individuals. Now, looking to other relevant acts, while we won't go into details of each of these other pieces of legislation, it is important you're aware of them, their purpose, their content as it relates to your practice. So these include the Public Hospitals Act, the Integrated Community Health Services Centers Act, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, the Personal Health Information Protection Act, and the Ontario Human Rights Code, the Radiation Emitting Devices Act, and the Transport of Dangerous Goods Act. Let's turn now to the CMRITO Code of Ethics, which is a key document that guides professional behavior for all registrants. The purpose of the Code of Ethics is straightforward but essential. It outlines the ethical principles and responsibilities that every MRIT is expected to uphold. While the standards of practice describe what registrants must do, the Code of Ethics focuses on how they are expected to conduct themselves as regulated health professionals. Its purpose is to support safe, respectful, person-centered care by setting expectations for ethical decision-making, professional integrity, and responsible behavior. Both the CMRITO Standards of Practice and the Code of Ethics are established in consultation with registrants and the public. This is a nice visual that ties together the ethical principles in the Code of Ethics. If you look to the very top of this circle, registrants have a responsibility to the public. So for example, to provide only those services for which they are qualified by education, training, or experience, and to maintain high standards of professional conduct. Next, as we travel clockwise, we have a responsibility to patients. For example, to uphold the principles of informed consent, respect the dignity, privacy, and autonomy of our patients, and to treat all patients equitably. Registrants also have a responsibility to the profession. For example, to assist each other and the CMRITO in upholding the spirit and letter of the law, and to contribute to the development of the profession through continuing education and research. We as registrants also have a responsibility to colleagues and other healthcare providers, for example, to educate others about practices and procedures relating to the profession and to consult, refer, or cooperate to the extent needed to best serve the patient's interests. And finally, registrants have a personal responsibility, for example, to maintain and apply current relevant scientific and professional knowledge, avoid conflicts of interest, and practice free from influence of alcohol, drugs, or other substances. Moving on, next we'll take a few minutes to review the purpose of the bylaws, which is that final layer of the legislative framework we introduced at the beginning of the presentation. The CMRITO bylaws are the rules that govern how CMRITO operates. More specifically, bylaw number 60 is the consolidated bylaws relating to the administration and internal affairs of the college. It's important to keep your eye out for any consultations related to the bylaws to ensure you stay informed of any proposed or approved changes. The bylaws set out the professional liability insurance requirements for registrants and outlines the information published in the public register and other information that needs to be provided to the college. For example, did you know that if you use a name in practice, that's not your legal name, you are required to register that name with CMRITO. And beyond keeping your name current, you're also required to keep your employment and contact information up to date in your CMRITO account and must make any updates within 7 days of any changes. I note that the primary method of communication or contact from CMRITO is by email. So the CMRITO bylaws requires you to also provide an email address to the college that you check regularly. A helpful tip is you want to make sure that CMRITO domain is on your safe sender list in your email account to avoid any important emails from the college going to your junk mail and getting missed. And before I pass this back to Johnny and we jump into several practice scenarios, we'd just like to share other guidance documents that support understanding and compliance with Standard 1. You can follow the QR code on screen to access our series called What You Must Know About. So this is a series of practice guidelines on varying topics that you can see on the screen there that are available in full on the CMRITO website. So now I'm going to pass it back to Johnny to kick off our practice scenarios.
Thanks, Carrie. Let's apply what we've learned about Standard 1 through some of these practice scenarios. Please keep in mind that these practice scenarios may involve many other indicators from other sections of the Standard of Practice, but today we are focusing on Standard 1. So our first scenario here is I've been asked to perform an unfamiliar procedure. What should I do? If a registrant is not competent to perform a procedure, treatment, or intervention, they must not continue and must take appropriate action to address the situation. The appropriate action may vary depending on the situation. For example, if performing a procedure that is part of the registrant's regular role expectations with a particular practice setting, then the registrant should obtain the competencies necessary to provide safe, effective, and ethical services to patients in their care required for those procedures. The registrant may also consult with their supervisor or manager to determine how this may be achieved. Registrants must also take responsibility for decisions and actions, whether they were conducted independently or part of a healthcare team. Registrants must also work with other members of the healthcare team to achieve the best possible outcomes for the patient. Registrants must also adhere to the standards of practice. So in this situation, aligning with practice standard 3, diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, and standard 8, continuing competence will be mandatory. There are also considerations based on the Code of Ethics to ensure that the registrants are competent to provide the medical radiation or imaging services required by patients within a particular practice setting. So I want to also make reference here to the CMRITO publication, What You Must Know About Performing Procedures. In Appendix D of this practice guideline, there is a very useful decision-making guide which walks registrants through a series of questions for performing a procedure in their specialty, including, do I have the legal authority to perform the procedure? Do I have the necessary knowledge, skills, and judgment to perform the procedure safely, effectively, and ethically? Is there an appropriate order in place giving me the authority to perform the procedure? Have all the conditions set out in the CMRITO Standards of Practice been met? At any point in these steps, if the answer is no, the registrant must stop, do not perform the procedure, and take the necessary action.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. So I'm going to move on to a second scenario now. And so this is a patient is refusing an exam. What should I do? Looking to standard 1 for guidance specifically, registrants must adhere to all relevant provincial and federal legislation and guidelines governing the practice of the profession, adhere to the standards of practice set by the college, and adhere to the code of ethics and the bylaws of the college. So looking at indicator D first, considerations related to the Healthcare Consent Act would be relevant here. Similarly, indicator E, adhere to the standards of practice. So in this scenario, not only is standard 1 applicable, but others, including standard 3, diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, come into play, where there's a requirement to ensure that patient consent has been obtained. And standard 5, relationship with patients, requires the registrant to carry out the diagnostic or therapeutic procedure only with the informed consent of the patient or the patient's substitute decision maker, and comply with all relevant legislation, including the Healthcare Consent Act. A central principle of consent is that the patient retains the right to be respected and maintains ownership of what happens to their body at all times, as aligned with their beliefs and values. As a result, consent can be withdrawn by the patient at any time before or during the procedure. We can also look to the Code of Ethics for guidance, where registrants are required to act in the best interests of their patients by upholding the principle of informed consent, including the rights of the patient or the patient's substitute decision maker the rights of the patient or the patient's substitute decision maker to refuse service. In this particular case, if you've explained the procedure to the patient, answered any questions they have within your scope, and they're still not comfortable proceeding with the procedure, you must respect the patient's decision and their right to change their mind. This requires us to shift from a task-based mindset, just get the procedure done, to a professional judgment mindset where you determine appropriate next steps based on the discussion with the patient. If the patient ultimately refuses the procedure, the MRIT would be expected to follow any relevant policies and procedures established within their facility related to the refusal of services, including any requirements for documentation.
Our next scenario here is, I received an email indicating I have to submit my QA e-portfolio by December 31st. Is this mandatory? In short, yes, it is mandatory for all active registrants to complete the QAE portfolio by December 31st each year. In accordance with the quality assurance regulations under the CMRITO Act, registrants must participate in self-assessment and continuing education or professional development activities in the manner approved by the Council in order to maintain the knowledge, skills, and judgment required to practice the profession in accordance with the standards of practice and ethics set by the college. A member shall keep a record of his or her self-assessments and participation in continuing education or professional development activities in the form and manner approved by the committee. So your participation in the CMRITO QA program ensures that you are in compliance with the legislative requirement of the RHPA and your adherence to the Standard 1 Indicator G. But more importantly, your participation ensures that you maintain your competence throughout your career. It aims to promote the ability of registrants to respond to changes in practice environments, advances in technology, and other emerging issues. It also assures the quality of practice of the profession and promotes continuing evaluation, competence, and improvement among registrants. So this scenario is an example of adherence to the QA regulation, but please note that registrants must adhere to all regulations under the CMRITO Act, including registration, professional misconduct, and advertising.
So a few key takeaways. Practice Standard 1 is grounded in law, ethics, and professional expectations. MRITs are accountable for their decisions and actions, and when presented with a problem or question, check the legislation, refer to the standards of practice, and apply ethical reasoning. We've referenced some of them already today, but CMRITO has a number of publications and other resources to support your practice. All of these are accessible through the resources section of the CMRITO website. Here you can see this on the screen there where you can access them from the top menu. Here you'll find access to all of our publications, including the Standards of Practice, the Code of Ethics, our series of What You Must Know About practice guides, our newsletter insights, and much more. Similarly, you can access our videos and webinar recordings from here, as well as quick links to the acts, regulations, policies, and bylaws that govern your practices in MRIT and the jurisprudence course. In addition to these resources, CMRITO's professional practice team includes a number of experienced practice advisors representing multiple specialties that can assist you with your practice questions and direct you to the appropriate resources to support your practice where needed. You can call or email us anytime. We'll share our contact information on screen momentarily, which brings us to the end of our webinar. So thank you so much for joining us today. I hope this was a good refresher of your professional accountabilities related to legislation, standards, and ethics. You're welcome to visit our website or contact us at any time with your questions. Our contact information is up on the screen. Again, on behalf of both Johnny and I and the staff at CMRITO, I hope you found this webinar helpful. You can revisit this webinar anytime on demand on the CMRITO website, where you can find a variety of webinars to support your practice.